This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah, so volume's good, recording's good, screen is good. How's everybody doing tonight? Doing all right? Okay, cool. So before I get into this, I just want to ask, does anybody here, who here actually uses GraphQL now for work? Yeah? Okay. Have you wanted to go back to traditional REST since starting with GraphQL at work? No? Any issues you want to share with us? Getting people on board? Yeah, it's tough. Okay. Okay. Okay, so getting buy-in from everyone across the board has been really tough, right? Yeah. You can, yeah, that's definitely something I've encountered before. But no one else. Does anybody work on GraphQL like on personal side projects or anything like that? So it's all pretty much a new concept to everybody? Okay, cool. So my title is What's all the fuss about anyway? Because we're hearing a lot about GraphQL and it's like, why is this such a big deal? Why are we hearing about it? I will jump into that in a second, but I just want to introduce myself. Actually, I'm Josh Oppenheim. I'm a senior consultant at Tensure.io. Tensure, we're just a consulting firm. We, come on board to help people, other companies, skill them up, do work with them, pass off projects. That's my Twitter handle, and this is my GitHub as well. So you can go poke around and make fun of all my repos. So today, I need to make sure I stay on here. So we're going to talk about, this is kind of what the agenda is. We're going to talk about what is GraphQL, talk about why we want to use it, and then we're going to actually look at Angular and GraphQL together, kind of discuss kind of from an Angular perspective, how to go about that. What does it look like? How hard is it really to put in? And then we'll talk about some strategy as well. I want to address some of the concerns about getting buy-in from across the board. Talk about essentially kind of, if I want to use GraphQL and I'm a front-end dev, how do I get my company to allow me to put it in? That's a really hard thing to do. And if you're a consultant, how do you get your client to buy in? How do you give them, so we'll talk about that and then we'll take questions. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of ask some of the experts what GraphQL is, and there's a documentary written by Honeypot, created by Honeypot, and they did a little promo that I stole, and I thought I'd just play it real quick for everybody, and then we can talk about it some more. So. And I'm going to go back to it. We're going to push play. Great. One moment. Do we have a volume on the TV that we can put up?
I'm sure there's buttons for it.
Oh.
Yeah.
There we go.
If not, you might have to use your computer speakers.
Probably say it's a query language for your API, which is true. And I feel like
What is GraphQL?
so everyone's gonna probably say it's a query language for your API, which is true. And I feel like that's like the most succinct way you can explain it to someone.
GraphQL is fundamentally a way to define a schema that represents your application domain model, and then it provides a runtime execution engine to make queries against that schema.
GraphQL is a facade. It is a facade on top of your application. You interface so that you can selectively say, I would like this piece, this piece, this piece.
Clients are able to tell the GraphQL server what they need while letting the server decide how to respond to that query in the most efficient way possible.
Normally, when you query for something, you might get like this giant object back and like it has a bunch of stuff in it that you don't want or care about or need. But with GraphQL, you can just query for like exactly the things that you need to display or do whatever, and that's just what's going to come back.
GraphQL is a query language for API that shifts the contract between clients and servers that allows the server to say, these are the capabilities that I expose, and allows the client to describe their requirements in a way that ultimately empowers product developers to build the products they want to create.
Okay, so that's it for tonight. You have your answer. No, that's really cool though. What I like about that promo is that everybody on there had their own definition, even one of the co-creators. And I would suspect that if you were to ask all the creators together, they would all have different answers. And so I have my own answer as well. And the way I say it is GraphQL is a query language that allows a client to request specific data in a specific structure from an API. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, but here's a visual for that. This is off the GraphQL documentation. Essentially, your client's going to describe data, and this is essentially just a example. You have your project, and you have a name and a tagline of contributors. And so we know that you can query that, right? And so on a query, if you ask for what you want, you have a project, and we're going to give it a name, GraphQL. And all we want back is the tagline. And so the result is predictable. We know that it's going to be a project with a tagline. And we're going to get that 100% of the time every time we ask for it that way. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what GraphQL is. You can describe your data in a declarative way, and you know what you're going to get back. And GraphQL is a function that gives it back to you in that structure. So I want to talk about ordering pizza. We just got pizza tonight. So this is a lot of written down, but essentially it's to compare and contrast GraphQL with REST. So REST is like, I want to order a pizza, but I have to just call them and say I want a pizza. When it gets to me, then I can take off toppings I don't want. I can cut it into the pieces I want to cut it into. Maybe I only want, a couple pieces. Half of it can be one topping, the other half. But I have to get what I get, and then I can take care of all that other stuff for myself. If I want breadsticks, for example, I need to call them again. Say, hey, I want some breadsticks too. I can't include that in my first order, right? Kind of with REST, we call. I want authors. I get all the author information. I might get some relational IDs for other entities, and then I have to go call for those too. But I can't do it all at one spot in one place. GraphQL is the opposite. It's essentially, I tell you exactly what I want. I want a pizza with pepperoni only. And I want breadsticks as well. That's it. Makes a little more sense in that world. To me, it makes more sense. So that's kind of my example. So we can talk about REST a little bit more. Essentially, a component needs, let's just talk about, this is an example, it's hypothetical. I have author, and then this author has written lots of books, and so I have a database with books, and I have a database with authors, and I want to get one author, but I want to get all the books written by that author. But the author, I just want the name and the birth date, and with the book info, I just want the title of the book, and I just want the publishing date. I don't want any of the other information. With REST, what I would have to do is I would have to make a call to the author endpoint, get my author info, and then also make a call to the books endpoint and get all the books with the author ID, right? So that's 2 calls at least. Not to mention the data that comes back from that call may have more than just a name and a birth date. Probably would get a good amount of data. Well, I'm going to have to, once I've gotten all this information, I've got to manage it. I've got to structure it, discard the stuff I don't want, and then I can use it and present it in my UI. So there's a lot of complexity to that. You get into bigger enterprise applications, like I'm sure everyone here works in or have seen, where you're getting into a world of multiple API calls, a lot of massaging data, and then if you're having to do a state store, having to update the store correctly with the right structures. It's a lot of work, and a lot of UI developers have to spend a lot of time doing that and not on the UI. So from a GraphQL perspective, the same thing. I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but I call one endpoint, describing the data I want, and I get what I want back. And here's an example of what that query could look like. So it's a legitimate query. I don't have like this application running, but if I was to write a query to get books by author, I'm passing an ID of 1 because that's the author ID, right? And I say I just want name, birth date, and on the books I want the title and the publishing date, and that's it. So from a client perspective, this is all I need to send to the GraphQL server to get what I need. So when I get my response back, I'm going to have it exactly in that structure. I can update my store with that as soon as I get it. There's no normalization of data I have to deal with. I don't have to make multiple calls and deal with all that nonsense, essentially. It gives me a lot more time to work on the things I want to work on, like my product. So PayPal said, essentially, this is a quote from PayPal. They said, UI devs are spending less than a third of their time building UI. The rest of their time is spent on figuring out where and how to fetch data, filtering or mapping over the data, and orchestrating API calls. So GraphQL is a solution to this problem, in my opinion. Essentially, let's take all that time away that was spent on all that orchestrating, fetching, figuring out what I'm doing with this data, and work on the UI instead. Let me make my calls, my queries, my mutations, and then let me get back to what I do best, making my UI a good experience for the user, because that's what we're building here, a front end, right? So before I get into essentially like an Angular application and kind of how to put it all together as a client, I want to go over kind of quickly what a GraphQL server looks like, because that's what the client's making requests to. And so just to demystify the magic, essentially the server is just getting a request. It's usually a post request, and it's got a payload, and that payload's a query or a mutation or a subscription, which we're not going to get into. But it's the same as opening a socket, so you can just listen from an API. And it just runs a function. That's all GraphQL is, the server itself. It's just a function. And this is an example of a JavaScript function, the JavaScript implementation. So GraphQL is implemented on multiple languages, but because we're in Angular and we're talking about JavaScript, it's going to be, those are my examples. So from a JavaScript perspective, this is all you need to run a GraphQL function or a server. And we're going to get into there's a couple components that kind of make it work. And so we're going to go over those three things together and just kind of talk about it. Essentially, the first thing we have is a schema. So a schema is an object, or a string actually, that describes what queries, mutations, types. Essentially, it's a map of all the GraphQL, like the client can do. I can make a mutation would be, I want to change data, I want to add new data, I want to delete data. A query is I just want to get data. So this is one example. It's very, very simple. It's saying, hey, I have a type, it's a query. It's named hello, and it's returning a string. So that means that now the client can make a query asking for hello. The query is named hello, and it will get a string back. So this is actually what part of what is given to the server, so it can understand what a query named hello, what it is. The second thing is we have these things called resolvers. They're functions that are called essentially when a query mutation is passed. So let's say hello is passed in a query, then there's a resolver that has a name for hello in a query, and it runs that function, and that's the function that gets the hello or the string and then serves it back. Here's an example. It's very simple. The name is hello, and it returns hello world as a string. So if I sent a query saying hello, the server will return hello world. So I'm just wanting to look at it one more time. We've got our query right here. I'm sorry, our schema, which is of a query. We've got a resolver, which is just one function. And then we've got the actual call to the GraphQL function. That is all you need for a server to run. So when your client makes a request, this is what you're doing. So this is kind of demystifying the whole server. Now that function does some really cool things. If you have a resolver that has to call multiple APIs, it will do it in parallel. It will optimize and go it does a lot of things under the hood that makes it really quick so we don't have to do it for it. So that's pretty neat. Okay. Before I jump into Angular and Apollo client, I did want to take some questions on the server because I'm running through this a little quickly. Does anybody have any questions so far? Go ahead. So if there's an error, I'm sorry. Sure. Okay. 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 Yeah. GraphQL, well, in this implementation was just the function. If you do a .catch, it'll catch any errors, one like that. So when you write the resolver functions too, so let's say your resolver function has to go to a data source and check for that, right? And it gets, there's no, like, let's say you call an API endpoint that, or you go to a database and you look for that object and it comes back and there's nothing there, then you return that response saying this is empty or it's an error. So there's more elegant ways to catch them, but like from the basic, I mean, in general, however you would catch errors in JavaScript is how you would do it with just a vanilla, GraphQL function. If you were using like a Apollo server or whatever, you would catch the error and then you would return Apollo errors, and it gets a little more descriptive and easier to use, but essentially catch your error and return it correctly and it'll handle it. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else?
Status code or something like that. Is GraphQL like writing like that for you, or is it all just what you build on? If you want a particular error code that it's not found versus for like permissions to fetch that.
Yeah.
You build that on top of inside your.
Yeah. So if you're using a vanilla GraphQL function, it has no conception of HTTP requests at all. It's just a function. If you're using like a library, like an Apollo server, you can leverage Apollo errors that handle things like that as well. But from just the vanilla function, you've got to bake that in. It's just another function you're calling. So when you return to the client as your response, you have to identify what your error code is going to be and everything like that. So that's why these libraries are very helpful. Go ahead.
So is GraphQL basically go between or REST API, or are you actually going to query the database, and that sort of thing with GraphQL?
Yes. Yeah, so essentially the data sources mean nothing to, it doesn't matter. Whatever they are, they are. So if they're API endpoints, if they're databases, if they're files, it's whatever you're getting this data from is what those resolvers are going to go to. So as far as GraphQL is concerned, the data source is data source is data source. We good? Okay. All right, so I'm going to jump into Angular and Apollo and jump right into client-side stuff and basically forget servers. I'm going to assume we all know how the server is going to do its thing and everything, but we're at an Angular meetup and I want to talk about Angular and using Apollo. And I chose Apollo because it's used more. There are other libraries out there that you can use for clients. Relay is one of them. It was written by Facebook for their React framework that they wrote, but it's usable. You can use it in Angular as well. But Apollo is just, it's very popular. It's easy. It's very, very easy to use. So basically, if you go to the Apollo documentation and you look for Apollo Angular, which is written by Camille, I can't pronounce his last name. It starts with an M. He's part of the guild. He's one of the, he's one of the core people when it comes to GraphQL. He wrote Apollo Angular, and essentially it's an Apollo client for Angular. And so the only thing you have to do now today is you go and you add ng-add Apollo Angular, and you have Apollo in your application. That's it. For if you're using schematics, which I'm assuming everyone would be using, it's what I use. So it is that easy. So if you run this, you have Apollo client and you have a GraphQL client in your server, in your application. You may not be using it, but it's there. So it is that simple. It does create essentially just another module. So that's what happens. This is a snapshot essentially of like once you've run your ng-add, this is what you're going to see in your Apollo Angular GraphQL module. It's just going to create a client with an in-memory cache, which is your state store. It's generally by default going to use an HTTP link because it's assuming your server is somewhere else, and you just give it the URI right here, and you're done. From there, whatever component you want to use to actually make queries, you'll inject this service, I believe. You'll inject Apollo Angular, and you will just use it. So it's that simple. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. Don't inject it, don't use it. But that's all you need to do essentially to have Apollo in your Angular app. So it is very, very easy to just throw in there. You can find more information on this at this location. That has a really good tutorial on how to actually go through it, and there's a lot of other things you can do with Apollo. State management is one of them, right? So I did want to get, this is kind of where I want to get to. Strategy. So a lot of people were talking about getting clients or people at my job on board with adopting GraphQL into my application. I think at this point I've kind of communicated already what the benefits are. One endpoint, I don't have to deal with normalization of data at all once I make my call. Essentially all the data manipulation is offloaded onto something else, right? So I, as a UI developer, don't have to worry about any of that. All I have to worry about is calling my data the way I want to see it, and I can work on other things. So one of the first things I think that we can do is, and actually addresses your issue with getting the entire business on board, is keeping the server on your front end. So if you wanted to, let's say I'm working at, I don't know, where do you work? Do you mind me asking? Sir? Where? Park Mobile? Okay. So if you didn't have to get your back-end devs on board, and it really was just up to your team, or even just you as a front-end developer, to throw GraphQL on your front end, is it something you could actually do at that point? Okay. Right, you wouldn't have to get everybody to buy in, right? So putting a server on the front end, again, remember, it's just a function. So let's say all those API endpoints that you're already hitting, you can abstract away from the components and into your GraphQL layer, into your resolvers. And now you can really focus on the UI getting built and still get the benefits of using GraphQL. It's not on a remote server, but in reality, and this is kind of a philosophical issue, but the front-end devs really should be the ones writing the schema anyway. I mean, the reality is that this is for a front end. GraphQL is not for the back end. It's for the UI developers to get data the way they want it. So they should be the ones describing the data. So they should be writing the schema. They should be writing the queries and the mutations. And all the rest of it, like the resolvers, that can be handled by the back end team or the front end team if they're already getting data from data sources. So at that point, I would say just throw it on the front end. and just added one component. You don't have to add it to any components. You can do an ng add, have Apollo inside, and not use it at all. Or you can throw it in one component, query some data, see the benefit, and you're done. It's easy. No one else needs to know about how, like, you don't have to get another server stood up. You don't have to get business on board. You can even work it into a ticket that you have. It doesn't take a lot of work to just get one component to use GraphQL. Now for the TypeScript Nazis, I would say maybe that's not the right word. Matt is one of them. Type safety is a huge deal. And I like type safety. I like TypeScript. Some people want it for everything, and that's okay. To each his own. Hey, what's going on? But essentially, GraphQL code generator will look at all your operations and look at all your queries and schema and everything, and it'll generate all the types for everything. So you can type your functions, you can type your resolvers, you can type your queries, you can do everything, and so that actually will help satisfy a lot of like the arguments against GraphQL. Well, I can't type it, or I have to rewrite this all on my own. You know, we'll run the code generator. You'll have all your types. You're good to go. So I would say those three things are key for being able to essentially sneak in GraphQL easily into your stack without having to get buy-in from everybody. And then the reality is once you start using it, you'll start seeing the benefits pretty quickly. One of the main benefits that I see for front-end development is that you will actually get your development speeds up because you're not doing so much work managing your data. So you're able to build quicker. And so as this goes and the momentum starts to build, buy-in will come quickly because then you can share those types across the board to the back end as well. And so at some point they'll want to pull it off and put it in a server. But as far as like keeping it on the front end, it's really not that bad. Like it's not going to, the performance is not going to take much of a hit at all. So you really, it's negligible. You can load test and do all that if you want. But this is kind of where I was going to show, I have a tutorial application that is working already. It's a clone of Tour of Heroes. Does anyone here know Tour of Heroes from the Angular docs? Anybody? Yes? Okay, cool. So it's a great walkthrough and tutorial. And so what I did was I cloned it and then I added Apollo Angular and kept the server on the front end to show how you can do that and basically just throw it in. So it is calling the same API endpoints, but the resolvers are doing that. And so the components are just making queries. So one of the key things I wanted to show was essentially the differences between the Apollo client before. If you remember, there was an HTTP link that it was injecting so that you can actually call a remote server. In this case, we're using a schema link, which takes an actual server schema. So this is the schema right here that you would actually pass to a server on the back end. So if you ever do want to pull it off and put it somewhere else, you just pull the file away and put it wherever. I mean, it's already there. So you don't have to do any changes. You just swap your schema link for an HTTP link, move your schema to your server, and you're done. These are all your resolvers. I wanted to show. Here's a schema for those that aren't very familiar. It's just describing, the queries. So we've got heroes, hero, and search heroes, just like on Tour of Heroes. It describes what you're getting back. There's your mutations. And then you've got your input and your type. And then you can make queries. So you have your operations. Here's an example of a get query. So instead of doing an HTTP call, you just pass this query and the resolver gets the data. What's neat about this is that you can change your query and not change the resolver. So if I didn't want the ID anymore, I just take it out of my query. The resolver stays the same, but GraphQL handles it and doesn't give me the ID anymore. So the data is normalized already for me. So as a developer, when I'm writing my code and I write if I have a component, right, and I say, hey, I want this data, I just write, this is all I write. So I want to show this running because I did want to showcase a little bit the state management that comes out of the box. one of the big benefits Apollo Client gives is state management already for me. So I don't have to set up my own state management. If I make a query at all, it's going to end up updating my cache. So I make a query to the server. When it returns, it already updates my store. So I don't have to do any of that at all. I'm not here to talk about comparing and contrasting any other state management tools, but I will say that this takes care of a lot of the work, and I prefer it. So when I loaded this page, oh, by the way, also you have this cool thing called Apollo Dev Tools that you can use, and you can see essentially what you can actually run your own mutations and queries just like you would on GraphQL and test it. And you can actually look at the queries that you've done before. So when I loaded this page, it ran get heroes so that we could present the heroes, right? This is the query it actually ran. It's right there. And so it shows what I got, and it also has a cache, my state store. I can look at it. I have all my heroes right here in the state store. So out of the box, I can watch the store. Any changes in the component will update automatically. If I want to click a hero, it'll grab this. It ran another query, the get hero query, and you can see how it's doing everything. You can watch it. You can see the cache change. But if I was to change the name, now I didn't add anything else. There's no other state management tools at all. There's no NGRX. There's nothing in here. If I save this, I'm not going to go grab all the heroes anymore, but the query from before on the heroes page will update, and it's right there. So you can see the cache actually changed and was updated for me. So if I was to look at ID 12, it's already updated. So that's pretty neat because I don't have to do any of that stuff myself. It's already done. Gosh, and that was a mutation because I was updating the hero. So you can go through this and you can even run, I mean, you can do anything you want. You can come in here and run it again. You can give it a different ID. If I want to do a different one, say I want to do 13 and run it, it'll actually change. Well, it didn't work because there was no 13, but you can play with your mutations and queries right in here. It's a little playground. So I'll jump back into here. And this is your link to that project. You can pull it, you can clone it, you can take a look at it, play with it, do whatever you want. But essentially, that's to show how easy it really is to use it. And this is using the strategy of not putting it on the back end at all. So you're just from an Angular development perspective, I'm going to implement GraphQL to get the benefits of it, and that's it. I'm not going to get the backend involved. I'm not going to change anything. I'm still using all the data sources, but I'm going to utilize GraphQL and the benefits that come with it. And that is it for my presentation, but I did want to ask if anybody had questions about anything. Could be about life as well. It doesn't have to be GraphQL. Matt.
What state management framework are you using? You said you prefer it, so I'm curious.
Exactly, Apollo Client, yeah. So Apollo Client out of the box has state management already. Right, so it's there already for me. A lot of the hard work that comes from some other tools in general, or just home baking my own way of doing it with a behavior subject, is already there for me. I don't have to do any of that. So it really does free me up to be able to work on UI. I know there's other questions. There's got to be. Oh, please don't ask me a hard one.
What are like the downsides? What are the harder parts about GraphQL that you run into? Surely there's a lot of easy ones, but I imagine it's not like all of the big ones, right?
Right, so you have to learn the language. I think for me, the biggest problem with GraphQL is the learning curve. You have to learn a new language. Just like with SQL, you have to learn SQL to be able to use it. I would say it's worth the trouble though. The benefits do outweigh that. I mean, once you learn the language and you can use it, I mean, it's incredible how fast you'll get things done. But that is a very real issue.
How complex is the resolvers have to be? You're passing in variable amounts of this pushing one. How complex does that have to be to just set data?
So I'm glad that's actually a good question. The good news is the resolvers don't manage that. GraphQL will, the function will. So the resolver returns whatever the payload is, and the GraphQL function will identify what's inside of the query and give it just the relevant data. So the resolvers don't ever have to change, which is really good news. Because can you imagine if one component changed, I want to get the ID now, instead, does that mean I have to do a new resolver? No, it just means that the query changed, and that's it. So that's, yes.
I know you changed that information on the front end and it changed in the state, but did it send the object along to the database as well to be updated?
Yeah. Yeah, so the resolver was calling an HTTP request, which was a post or a put to update the name. And I was doing a manual update to the store.
Which part is in charge of type checking and making sure like you have good inputs against the schema?
Like on
when you're doing a change on the fly in the client,
yeah,
it's going to go affect the database. Which part does the sanity check, making sure that you have like the right type for that input?
Like from a mutation perspective?
No, I mean, you have a hero name. If
Yeah.
somebody was to enter like a number or something that is not.
Like not a string?
Yeah.
Or, well, a number?
How does the sanity check goes from like the client to the database before updating it?
That's probably going to be on the resolver to handle. Because that's not a GraphQL problem. That's now type safety in general is handled by the code generator. You can write your own types, or you can use code generator to generate types. So if you say, hey, this mutation takes this type, and you run the code generator, when you're writing your code, it will not let you. I mean, if you're using TypeScript, it won't let you. So that's one way. And then another way also is if you're going to have to do it on that, like let's say it's a valid type, but it's not a valid type, right? Because it's got like special characters or something like that. You can do that on your resolver, or you can do it wherever you want to do that normally when you're doing inserts into a database.
So does GraphQL have a concept of types in itself? Or is it only when you're using TypeScript with GraphQL, using something like a client, that you get that type safety? Maybe you see like errors in your code before you even.
Right. So GraphQL has a concept of types, but they're GraphQL types. They have nothing to do with TypeScript. So from a TypeScript perspective, if you want to type, using code generator will create types for your GraphQL queries and mutations and operations for you. So you don't have to do it by hand. But I don't know if, does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not Apollo and it's not GraphQL by itself. It's actually so you have a choice. You can write your own types by hand in TypeScript, so you can have type safety when you write these, or you can run code generator, which is another library that will generate them for you, and which I recommend. Yeah, based on your schema and on all the operations. It'll type everything. It'll type all your resolvers, your queries, your mutations, and so you can't, I mean, if you utilize it, you're really not getting out of that one. So
GraphQL is trying to basically replace horizontal alternative of REST API, but it works on top of HTTP, right? So is there any project out there, like, or any configuration in Apollo that allows you to work using WebSocket instead of HTTP?
yeah, so there's a concept called subscriptions, and that would be addressing WebSockets. So it's not a query, it's not a mutation, but it's a type of subscription. And so that will when it makes a subscription call to a server that is like let's say it's an Apollo server, because it works really well out of the box, it'll connect and do a WebSocket. And so you just subscribe from across. Yep. Does everybody want to go use GraphQL now, or have I not convinced you? And if I have not, tell me why. Yes. Hmm?
Completely outsourced server, so that's one step on the request to go to that server, and for that server, I assume
Yeah.
that a whole whatever GraphQL server plus the request to the actual API. So you have like multiple steps that you need to get there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how that affect the performance of my app?
So there's a couple ways to address that. One way is, well, one thing out of the box that GraphQL will do, the server will actually make your API calls in parallel. So if there's multiple, let's say your front end needs to call multiple APIs already, right? You can manually make that happen in parallel if you want to run, if you want to. But GraphQL, if you call your GraphQL server, it'll go ahead and do that for you where it can. If you need data, for example, if you need an ID that's a result of one of your calls to get more data, then you have to wait for it. Another way is that you can actually make your server persistent and start caching specific data so that it's already there, like maybe high, it's used a lot. Cache it in your server so when it does get that request, it's ready to go already. But essentially, I mean, it's going to do everything it can to optimize to do it as fast as possible. So I would actually say you'd see an increase. I'm sorry, an increase in speed. Like I would say I would challenge this to test that. Go throw it in front of a bunch of API requests and do it without it, and then do it with, and see which one's faster. I mean, it should be the one that doesn't have that extra step would be faster, but I would be willing to guess that the GraphQL server will run those queries or requests quicker than you could do it on the front end. But I could be wrong. It could most certainly be slower. So it just depends.
I would say that my first question led to the second question.
Okay.
So my second question is that basically, let's say you have a microservices architecture. Right?
Yep.
From you have a gateway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that gateway is supposed to get all the requests for your whole set of APIs.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much doing the same thing that GraphQL is doing.
Yeah, the gateway.
Only one endpoint.
Yeah.
And everybody's hitting that endpoint.
Right.
So what's the difference? Like, what's the benefits between having this gateway?
Tell me does the gateway manage multiple calls?
The gateway is kind of like just one endpoint.
Uh-huh.
That is kind of like redirecting your API calls
Mm-hmm.
to the actual API.
Right.
The data.
Right.
But that's on the back end.
Yeah.
So that's my question is like, if you have worked with that, like, can you tell me like what's the benefit using GraphQL?
Yeah.
GraphQL.
Yeah.
And using like something like this type of gateway.
Well, so my first question is this gateway the same? When I think gateway, I'm thinking of it redirects to the correct API, but it doesn't manage data normalization. It doesn't manage multiple calls from one request. It just redirects to the right one. GraphQL, am I right when I say that? Okay, so the benefit is the same. GraphQL is going to manage all the multiple API calls that you would need to make, or data request, or going to the data source itself for the request that's coming in. So the client's not making multiple requests to that gateway. It's making one request. So with the gateway, you're still making multiple requests because you have to hit different APIs. It just happens to be that you're going through a gateway to get there. But that's irrelevant. You're still making multiple calls, which is expensive. But if I call GraphQL, hey, you can even use your gateway. Use your gateway to get in because those are good to use. I use them, but it goes to a GraphQL server. That GraphQL server then manages and normalizes all the data for the request. So you're going to get all the benefits you would from GraphQL regardless. Yep. So I've never done this, so I don't really know how to end, but if there are no more questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter, ask me whatever, tell me how. I mean, also feedback is always great. If I was wrong about something, please feel free to correct me. I never want to communicate things that are incorrect. And here's some references. I like to give props where props are due. So these are where I got my all my information, blah, blah, blah. We're going to throw up my slides, I'm sure. And then I'm just going to pass this on to Matt because he's going to take it from here and tell us what he's going to do. But thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thanks a lot, Josh. So that's it for tonight. Feel free to hang out, eat the rest of the pizza, have a drink or two. It's about 8 o'clock right now. As long as we're out of here by 8:45, 9 or so, we should be good. So that's all I got. Thanks for coming, everybody.